format. We have discussion panels, screenings, live performance, and now it's time to start the first very conventional panel called the entire symposium, where we will have 4 presentations. The format is conventional, but the subjects are not at all. So these 4 presentations are connected to each other in multiple layers. In most cases, we consider the existence of archives as a positive fact, but sometimes it's important to think about what is left outside the archives, or what might be done, when archives are not capable of covering everything. Yet there are some cases, historical cases, where we are not able to, delve into the issue with the help of archives. So we will start with Professor Peyami Çelikcan. Before giving the floor to Professor Çelikcan, personally I would like to say thank you to him for this great organization, because you all know Professor Çelikcan is the rector of hosting institution, Şehir University. So thank you very much, and now it's yours.
Hello again. After the morning session, we will discuss about these film archives in this panel, and I will try to make a presentation about the forgotten films in the European film archives, which represent our cultural heritage. As you all know, starting from the late 19th century, European cinematographers traveled around the Ottoman territories with their cameras. They shot many non-fiction films that featured cityscapes, landscapes, as well as the social, cultural, and entertainment life of that period. European cinematographers filmed the entire Ottoman territory, namely the Balkans, Istanbul, Anatolia, and the Arab Peninsula, and finally North Africa. Some of those short non-fiction films were screened for the local audience at that time, but mostly for the European audience, these films were screened in the movie theaters. All these early films about the Ottoman lands were kept by the film archives in France, Austria, the Netherlands, Britain, Germany, and so on. In this paper, I will try to analyze some of those forgotten films as a part of our cultural heritage. European perceptions of the East and the Ottomans were mostly shaped by travel books and paintings, which presented Easterners as exotic. The representation of Easterners in books and pictures was stereotypical, as Edward Said stated, by essentializing the East as static and undeveloped, the West fabricated Orient culture. It was true for the books and paintings and somehow for the photographs, but what about these early films? How they represent the Orient, the East, the Ottomans? I will try to answer this question through the travel films shot by these European cinematographers at the beginning of the 20th century. As you already know, the most common non-fiction type, film type is travel films, which has been accepted as the oldest and the most popular form of non-fiction film. The first cinematographers visited the Ottoman world and directed their cameras to Algeria, Istanbul, Balkan cities, Izmir, Kars, Ani, Cairo, and Alexandria, and so many other cities, to show the Western audience how East looks like. Because of that, these short travel films are very important for us. According to Richard Barzan, travel films demonstrated the power of the camera to bring people together through visual awareness of one another, and focus on the most ordinary customs in an attempt to record the lifestyle of a particular people. There is no doubt that all the travel films were providing visual awareness of one another. One stands for the East, Orient and Ottoman, while another for the West and Europe. By borrowing some terms, the travel films provide visual awareness of Ottoman to European or of East to West. The references to the terms East, West and Ottoman European constitutes another context for travel films. If the films are about the East, Ottoman, new questions arise on how Western cinematographers view East Ottoman world. What types of awareness are travel films create on the East Ottoman for the West European? Do those films represent the Orient stereotypes developed by the travelers, painters, or photographers? I will focus some of the films screened in several events in Istanbul. A group of films were screened in the past years, and because of the time limitation, I will focus on only some of those films, and I skip some part of my presentation. Mostly, I will focus on Turkey, Istanbul, made in 1910. It was from Austrian Film Archive. And I will touch on some of those films in this presentation. So I will try to answer these main questions through the Turkey, Istanbul film made in 1910. This still taken from this film. One of the most common topics for the filmmakers had been cities during the first quarter of the 20th century. For the early filmmakers, cities were the symbol of modernization. As a result of this view, different filmmakers in the various countries made films about modern city life in the West, including Dizzy Gaberto's The Man with the Camera, Alberto Cavalcanti's Nothing But Time, and Walter Ruttmann's Berlin, A City Symphony. All these films portray the rapid change and the increased rhythm of modern life in the Western cities during the 1920s. Eastern cities, on the other hand, mostly represented as a symbol of pre-modern periods in which the flow of life is slow, everything is old-fashioned, production techniques are traditional, and so on. The shots focus on the images reflecting these aspects of the Eastern life. The covered woman, street sellers, coffee houses are the most common topics about the Eastern cities, including Istanbul as well. Turkey, Istanbul, the short travel film, portrays trade centers, bazaars of Istanbul, in which people are selling and buying and hanging around. In most of travel films, fairs which emphasize the pre-modernity are very familiar topics. Although Istanbul was the center of modernization, politics starting from the mid-19th century, cinematographers like the travelogues focused on the pre-modern characteristic of Istanbul. In this regard, cemeteries are one of the most common symbols of pre-modernity and also the Orient Ottoman image. According to Hande Tekdemir, there is a common trope in Western travelogues on Constantinople to mention the preponderance of the cemeteries, which supposedly function as spaces of socialization and entertainment. This aspect of the cemeteries attracted the Western cinematographer very much. It was a common tradition for the families visiting cemeteries on Fridays and religious holidays, and even to eat play, and rest next to the deceased. It was a tradition before. Nowadays, we don't eat, entertain ourselves at the cemeteries. But in the past centuries, people were not just visiting the cemeteries, but they're spending leisure time in the cemeteries because to be close to the relatives lost. But today, traditions changed a lot. It completely contrasts with the Western Christian civilization perception of death. Tekdemir refers to the white and American traveler who visited Istanbul in 1907. He observes the manifest accessibility of the graveyards to the living life, and both never seem very apart in Constantinople. In other cities, the fact that life has an end and is put out of sight as much as possible. Just 4 years later, after the White's visit to Constantinople, Lumiere Brothers cinematographers films Constantinople focusing on Eyüp Sultan Cemetery. Very well composed shots with the addition of color provide, color edit of course later, provide a gorgeous view of the cemetery in the foreground and the golden horn in the background. It is not put out of sight, but put in the center of the city. Another travel film about Istanbul shot in 1915, titled as Turkey, it has almost the same characteristics of Turkey, Istanbul, by portraying Golden Horn, Bosphorus, and bazaars. The most interesting scene of this film is about the street barbers who shave their customers on chair on the street. As a representation of the pre-modernity, this scene reminds the remote past for the Western audience. Streets in the Ottoman world give lots of visual materials to the Western cinematographers. Not only in Istanbul, but all the cities filmed, including Cairo, Alexander, Sarajevo, Macedonia. We view the crowded streets having street sellers and craftsmen. In Cairo, the Arabian streets, we see a carpenter, and in Egypt, Alexandria, Cairo, a group of women cook bread in a traditional, unhealthy, and in a pre-modern way. In Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia film, the fantastic bargains between street sellers and their customers are take a prominent place. All these stereotypical images shaped by the Western narratives before. In this paper, I only focused on the travel films as a subgenre of non-fiction film. Even the travel films look more innocent in the shaping of those stereotypical images. They at least reproduce the Orientalist images in the cinema. The other subgenres in non-fiction film, news films, propaganda films, intensify the Eastern might even more. However, all these films, forgotten films, are the most powerful visual documents which reflect our past. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Çelikcan. So, while listening to your presentation, a sentence by Yahya Kemal came to my mind once. He wrote something like, "We are a society who lives together with the deceased." Biz ölüleriyle yaşayan bir milletiz, as far as I remember. Now we will continue with Esin, Paça, Cengiz, and Elif Akçalı's presentation on a very interesting project, I think it's an ongoing project and it's right now at the initial phase. So we will listen to their presentation, the Audiovisual Encyclopedia of Cinema in Turkey, Cinematic Spaces. Yes.
Thank you. We've changed the title a little bit into cinematic locations. Before I start, I'd like to emphasize the fact that we have 5 project assistants in this project whose names are up there, who worked with us. They're all Kadir University students, undergraduate and graduate students, who are involved in the project as much as we are. So we'd like to thank them here, even though 2 of us are presenting their part of the project. So yes, this is an ongoing project. We've sort of stopped working on it. We've started working last year in May, but because we're out of funds, we had to stop a little bit. Today we're going to talk about its briefly, let's say, define the project's content and scope, as well as discuss its method of archiving, or perhaps databasing would be a more appropriate word. The Audiovisual Encyclopedia of Cinema in Turkey is designed in an attempt to contribute to the study and research of cinema in Turkey, obviously, which became one of the leading film industries in the world, as most of you will probably know, between the years 1960 and 75, and is currently regarded as a significant national cinema within world cinema system. And as some people will probably note in this conference, the lack of an extensive public and accessible film archive in the country is probably one of the reasons why we ended up doing what we are doing at the moment. What started as an interest between us, going back to the scenes that we enjoyed watching and that we thought were meaningful in representing certain periods and tendencies in cinema, became a desire later on to collect and organize those scenes and make them available for anyone interested, including researchers, academics, filmmakers, and cinephiles. So let me first start with what we envision the project to be. It's quite ambitious in size. I don't know if we are able to ever going to finish it, but it is designed to become a web-based interactive digital resource. Although there's archival material, because of the way it's stored and shared collectively, it's more appropriate, as I mentioned, to call it a database that's always active and changing. The project aims to establish and open up a digital space where history of cinema in Turkey can be rediscussed and reinterpreted within the encyclopedia's volumes, such as locations, characters, certain parts of dialogue, repeating dialogue, festivals, film theaters, actors, musics, and so on, production houses, genres. And the main material of the encyclopedia will be individual scenes from films, which are cut and then tagged under certain titles, related to, of course, what the scene contains. And in addition, the project will make use of photographs, memoirs, and biographies, newspapers and magazines, documentaries and television programs on cinema of Turkey, links to other useful websites or any other relevant material, which are all going to be tagged. We also aim to interview and record filmmakers, academics, film critics, and viewers. And this newly produced material will be put under the relevant volumes of the encyclopedia. So eventually what we envision is a database that can easily be searched and that can offer navigation within films in terms of their scenes. This will become clear when Esin takes over, I assume, when she talks about the first volume that we've worked on in the last year. Yeah, some of the some of the works that inspired us are listed here, and of course the advent of videographic film criticism and the spread of video essays made by both academics and cinephiles online, which then later become useful resources for teaching material, teaching film studies, have become inspirational for us to pursue this project. Perhaps Richard Maltby's understanding of new cinema histories as a body of work that focuses on the circulation and consumption of film and examines cinema as a site of social and cultural exchange defines our standpoint. And we believe that the encyclopedia will be a useful resource for film studies similar to personal archives, biographies and documentaries. But of course, this is a different resource than conventional academic resources because the final version will allow the user to share and use it to some extent, to add material to it. And the project will allow telling stories about history of cinema in Turkey and interpreting the cinematic experience from multiple perspectives. So it's a kind of, it contains multiple subjectivities in the end, we hope it to be. And accounts of experiences and interpretations to enrich the understanding of film history and criticism. The project does not intend to solely list the prominent periods and events chronologically, but to include how cultural, social, and political context has affected filmmaking and the ways in which the audiences have been interrelated with this. So the first volume that we're working on, Cinematic Locations, examines the repeating locations in different films from different periods in Turkey. This volume will firstly question what makes a location cinematic or cinematically familiar, and look at the narrative structure and film language of certain films in an attempt to uncover the thematic and aesthetic tendencies in the cinema of Turkey. This discussion will include the ways in which these locations have been represented in films throughout the years, and will analyze the relationship between these representations and Turkey's transforming, of course, and changing political, social, economic, and artistic context, as well as their place in collective memory. I will pass the microphone to Esin now, who is going to describe it in more detail.
Now I'm going to elaborate on how we conduct this research and what we have done so far and what we plan to do. So cinematic locations, which will form the first volume of our encyclopedia, requires 3 stages to be completed, and that's how we work. And these stages do not come one after another. We all, do all of them simultaneously. So there are 3 steps. The first one is research, the second one is what we call production, and the third one is recategorizing and writing stage. The research demands detailed scanning of a great number of films, around 6,000 films, and all fictional films made in Turkey, starting from early 1900s to present day, and identifying locations that have repeatedly appeared in cinema of Turkey. So far we have scanned more than 1,000 films and identified more than 150 locations that appeared at least more than 30 films at the same locations. But these locations do not only include landmarks of the city such as Beyoğlu, Bosphorus Bridge, Galata Bridge, the Old Town, Clock Tower at Dolmabahçe, Taksim Square, Çamlıca Hill and Hilton Hotel at Harbiye, but at the same time, repetitive use of interiors of specific mansions, villas, newly emerged gated communities in the 80s and 90s in Turkey, and buildings in, as I said, hundreds of films. We have created a catalog with a list of films that include information about actors, production years, directors, dubbing artists, and so on, all details about the film, in addition to the time codes of each film in which the locations appear chronologically. And for each stage, we have also been scanning websites, memoirs, biographies, personal archives by cinephiles, Instagram and YouTube accounts, and old magazines in order to collect information about these cinematic locations we have identified and locate where they are physically in Istanbul and around Turkey. The second stage consists of film production, in which we will visit these locations and film their current state. This will not only provide us to track down the journey of each location in the cinema of Turkey in different decades, but at the same time we will be able to create a map on which we can trace the favorite film sets of mainly Yeşilçam and contemporary cinema in Turkey. In this stage, we will also shoot interviews with actors, directors, producers, set designers, or any other film professional that can be linked to these locations. And in the final stage of the project will be devoted to what we call reorganizing and categorizing of the audiovisual material and our writing and interpreting of what we have found so far. So at this stage, we will divide locations into categories, and experts from films in which these thematic locations appear will be cut from films. We will then rewatch and reorganize each video excerpt for each location and pen short analysis that aims to delve into questions such as how do these repeating locations serve to the narrative structures and narrational strategies of the films in which they are found, and when and how have we started seeing these locations in films in Turkey, and when and how did they disappear? In the end, I mean, this is a very basic design that we have done for this presentation, but actually it's going to be hopefully a lot more visually appealing. But in the end, what we want to do is we want to finish the scanning 6,000 films and cut scenes from them. And we aim to design a digital database which will be like this, which will look like this, where all the data, videos, analysis we put together will be shared on a website. And on this website, users will have access to videos of cinematic locations. We have edited from 6,000 films chronologically. As you can see, we did a very primitive version of it. Along with videos that show the present conditions of aforementioned locations, if they still exist, if they're demolished, and we'll put a map which will identify where they are. And at the same time, we will add a bibliography of academic studies that focus on representation of these locations. And I think this is the most interesting part, in which we will tag each video with keywords such as themes, genres, actors, characters, dubbing artists, characters, names, production years, directors, like everything we see in the video will be tagged on the website so that users can just, navigate on our website and explore history of cinema in Turkey through different titles depending on what they want to see or what their research is about. So in the end, we hopefully these are some keywords that we put together that if there is someone who is interested in, let's say, the character music hall owner, a gazinocu, then if you click on that, you will have list of all the characters in Turkish cinema, which appeared as musical hall owner, or you can put together different keywords like this together, and you can have a list of films, and you can actually watch the scenes in which all these keywords match with the material you will see. We are still in the process of cutting videos, but we have cut, as I said, so far we had more than 1,000 videos at the moment, but we wanted to show you 2 clips which will hopefully serve as a trailer to what we want to do and how our project is going to look like. One of them is Galata Bridge, which appears more than 150 films so far in the 1,000 film, and one old mansion in Istanbul. We haven't actually figured out where it is yet because it doesn't exist anymore, but we are trying to locate its physical space in Istanbul, and we are going to show you those videos so that hopefully you will get a visual. Okay, let's start with Galata Bridge.
Kapanmış gönül kapım, çoktan maceralara. Kapanmış gönül kapım, çoktan maceralara. Açma Allah aşkına, orada yeni bir yara. Yakma sakın, yıkma sakın. Girersen kalbime, çıkma sakın. Girersen kalbime, çıkma sakın. Yakma sakın, yıkma sakın. Girersen kalbime, çıkma sakın. Girersen kalbime. kalbime çıkma sakın. Bazı gün bilmem niye üzgünsün, sitemlisin. Bazı neşeli şakrak, bazı gözün nemlisin. Yakma sakın, yıkma sakın, girersen kalbime çıkma sakın. Girersen kalbime çıkma sakın. Yakma sakın, yıkma sakın, girersen kalbime çıkma sakın. Girersen kalbime çıkma sakın.
Okay, and one maybe more interesting but a shorter version of a mansion that we call the mansion with glass door and wooden staircase, because we don't know, where the mansion is or who it belonged to, but this is...
İmdat, kurtar beni amcalar!
Ama bebek yerine koyuyorsunuz beni siz.
Bebeksin de ondan.
Abi.
Rıdvan'ın işten çıkarılmasına o da üzgün.
Canına okudum seni.
Nereye gitti acaba?
Çok şeker bir kız değil mi?
Evet, evet de teyzeyi pek gözüm tutmadı.
Unutamam asla seni, her gün anıyorum yasla seni.
Size bir telgraf geldi efendim.
Kalbimi versem, sen ister miydin? Rüyana girsem, sen ister miydin? Gecemi katsam seni.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. In the coffee break, together with Nazirja, we were talking about Daniel Cohen and Roy Rosenzweig's the concept of invented archives. So I think this looks like a perfect invented archive, and I'm really curious about the upcoming stages of this project. Now we will continue with Canan, Balan. Okay. So Canan will talk about film history, human and the fragmented and or lost films in Turkey. Basically, she will reflect on the issue of how to study women's history in cinema in the absence of films by benefiting from other kinds of resources.
So I think I can start. In order to understand the positioning of early cinema in its own period and its effect in the cultural memory, as film historians, we have to take into account a diverse set of issues and fields of inquiry.
Here I am referring to periodizations, changing technologies of storing films, artistic styles, plots, cinematic references to other arts, cinematic resemblances written down by the intelligentsia of this period, and other more unlikely resources. Here, in this very brief time, I would like to take up some varying perspectives through which we can obtain more knowledge regarding the beginnings of Turkish Ottoman cinema. Even as early as the late 19-teens, film criticism was dominated by comments concerning the insufficiency of Turkish film production. Focusing on the insufficiencies and considering the production dates of the first films, one might be tempted to call the film industry a belated one in relation to the Western European and Northern American models. Indeed, the periodization of early cinema that is generally extended until the mid-19-teens has been reconsidered, taking into account the unique developments as well as the archival practices in countries outside the Western world. For example, Cengiz extends the early cinema in Shanghai to the late 1930s. Nipo Majumdar also suggests designating Indian films from the 1920s onwards as early cinema, and so on. Looking into the plots of feature-length films or fiction films made in the silent period in Turkey, it is noteworthy that a good number of them had women as their central characters. Only Binnaz seems to be available for the moment. The others are perhaps on the verge of being made available. Women were not only central characters in films though, or that is not the only area we must pay attention to in order to comprehend early cinematic experiences. A large portion of moviegoers were women. Women also took part in writing about and critiquing cinema, as well as writing scripts, distributing films, and producing them. Women also appear to be the main concern for many critics when discussing the goods and evils of cinema in an era where nation-making is underway. But before delving into the place of women in examining early cinema, of course I'm talking about the case of Turkey, I would like to briefly ponder upon the beginnings of cinema in this land and the multi-temporal interventions regarding its production. The unfortunate loss of or unavailability of the Ottoman silent films may parallel the cases of Asian and South Asian cinemas. Printed on nitrate and kept in municipality archive, these films were burnt down in 1959 during a fire that destroyed the archive. Another fire destroyed some of the remaining films stored at the customs office in the 1970s. Some surviving copies are now held in a university archive in Istanbul at Mimar Sinan University Film Archive, which, Esin was also referring to, which is under a rigid supervision. Considering the historiography and the unavailability of films, it does bring to mind the old discussion surrounding the first Turkish film, which was almost traditionally accepted as the demolition of the monument of St. Stephen made in 1914. A lot of revisionist historians, including myself, also researched about the Manaki brothers, the earliest filmmakers of the Balkans, although their national identities have also been a long and heated debate among Serbian, Greek, Romanian, and Macedonian national cultural historians. The Manaki brothers embody an important part of the cinema of the Balkans, or the Oriental periphery of Europe, in which most nations came under totalitarian regimes, fought with foreign occupiers, and had an ambivalent relationship with the Ottoman legacy or colonialism. The brothers may be posited at an intersection between various nations in the Balkans. It may be a vain attempt to claim their national origins. In this case, the newsreels we have seen today indeed open up new discussions around the early newsreels in Turkey, and Nezih Erdoğan has already given us a great context regarding this. Many of these films were made around World War I, and this is indeed another account for the reperiodization of the early cinema here. As I mentioned earlier, for the fiction films, Mimar Sinan University Film Archive appears to be the main source, although it holds allegedly only two of the silent films, Bijan Efendi the Steward and Binnaz. Though the current versions in the archive are fragmented and re-edited, the copy of Bijan Efendi is around 4 minutes shorter than the original version, while Binnaz is almost one-third shorter than its original length. And these films were re-edited decades later by film historians. The fragmented state of these films, however, might ask us to perhaps expand and center our attention on the translations, intermedialities, and intertextualities surrounding them. Bijan Efendi the Steward was an adaptation of a theater play which was rewritten from a French play entitled Le Prétexte, part of a series made between 1917 and 1921. Bijan Efendi the Steward centers around a character whom traditionally was considered to be a strong imitation of Charlie Chaplin. The film also makes reference to the Ottoman shadow play Karagöz, especially through its director and lead actor Şadi Karagözoğlu, meaning the son of Karagöz, who was the grandson of a Karagöz master. And the film indeed shows both visual and thematic resemblances to the Ottoman shadow play. The intersections between different media and texts, as well as the medium specificity revealed in this particular film, are significant in contextualizing Bijan Efendi the Steward beyond technical insufficiencies and a poor sense of aesthetics that seems dominant in its categorization in the older histories of Turkish cinema. Considering that the rest of the Bijan Efendi series is lost, the remaining episode itself is shorter than the original, and that it was re-edited according to literature texts, it is still controversial to come to a conclusion around the film's unique place in history. Instead, we can perhaps see the film as a cinematic palimpsest with multi-temporal layers and intercultural connections within a wider web of early cinema. Rashmi Sohni, in her great keynote talk, also has given us ways of doing that. The aura of Bijan Efendi might be better understood if we also take into account the burnt-down archives and the later practices through which the distant and near past co-created what we can see today. The primordial memory was found in the literary text and led to a recreation from the randomly kept remaining celluloids in seemingly linear editing style. Similar to Bijan Efendi, Binnaz is also a theater adaptation, which is allegedly a rewriting of Marion Delorme by Victor Hugo. Binnaz is a costume drama named after the main female character. The film is about two men's quarrel over a woman and the tragic death of one of them. It is noteworthy that in the reviews in Turkish film and theater history, this character is depicted as a yosma, which, especially in contemporary Turkish, is a pejorative word that refers to the beauty and low virtues of a woman. Agi Özgüç prefers the term vamp. As much as Binnaz offers more visibility to women than Bijan Efendi, its subtle misogyny is not less problematic. The plots found in traditional film history and the play itself depicts the leading woman character, Binnaz, as notorious for her charm that causes many an argument among the men around her. The use of cinematography and mise-en-scène furthers the female objectification in the film. There are shots of women dancing for the male character's visual pleasure. There is a point of view shot that underlines the act of voyeurism. In one shot, the audience sees the eyes of an unknown person looking at the camera hidden behind some cloths. In the next shot, it appears that these eyes actually watch a decadent party scene where Binnaz is kissing a man. Indeed, similar to Bijan Efendi, Binnaz shows most of the significant characteristics of early cinema, such as keyhole shots and self-reflexivity. It should also be noted that all female roles in this period were played by non-Muslim theater actresses, since Muslim women were still prevented from appearing on stage and in films. According to the reviews of the film published in this period, some of the main good qualities were the beautiful features and the non-professional performance of the, non-amateurish performance of the main actress. However, in a review written in 1920, Her body language and movements were also considered unpleasant. The film also appears to be following the conventions of diva films, which were popular especially among young women during and after World War I. And especially in the year Binnaz was made in 1919, we see a flourishing announcements of diva films with Asta Nilsson, Peyami and others. The sensuality in the mise-en-scène, close-ups, music, dance, prostitution, a love triangle, jealousy, and the woman positioned between a femme fatale and emotional excess are at the intersections between Binnaz and many diva films. Indeed, a sense of luxury and sensuality is also observed in a recent review by Çelikcan, who considers the mise-en-scène as a diegetic loyalty to the Tulip period in which the film takes place and was known for a celebration of arts, decadence, and to a certain extent debauchery. As a historical drama, Binnaz was found successful at the box office, both in Turkey and allegedly in the UK. Perhaps it was the play's influence that disappointed the journalists of the 1920s. Despite current attempts at contextualizing, finding international parallels, judging the male gaze of the camera, and appreciating the mise-en-scène, still more than half of the film is missing, and the remaining half is again re-edited. And again, what we witness is the involvement of the recent past in recreating the meaning that was perhaps inspired by, again, French literature, just as a lot of Italian diva films. A meaning, and this is a meaning which might show us a pattern of women performing for the men self-consciously, both within and outside the diegetic world. There are several lost unavailable silent films that show the period's stereotypical woman characters, such as the vamp and the diva in Governess, the would-be girls, the Claw, a love disaster in Istanbul, and so on. The would-be girls, the image of which you are seeing here, might be the most striking of them all. When looking into the novel it was adapted from, we come across a cinematic imagination of one of the main characters as a wannabe film star who stages scenes from famous films of Peyami and who identifies with Menikeli so much that her life ends up in a tragedy, like a lot of Menikeli films. This novel and others written by the same author imagine cinephiles of the late 1920s as women who were susceptible to the influences of cinema. The film appears unavailable, so we are unsure if the issue of female spectatorship problematized in the original source was also taken up in its film adaptation. If it was, though, a paradoxical self-reflexivity arises. How would a film treat the issue of women's spectatorship when it is based on a novel that opposes the values and practices spread by cinema? Since the only types of films the novel's characters appear to enjoy are Italian and French melodramas, which are, from Safa's perspective, escapist films made by the occupying countries, viewing this film as a local production perhaps negated the story's ostensible critique of cinematic identification. Perhaps young female audiences watched a national film in which fictional young women were corrupted by European melodramas. Could that have worked as a warning to women or instill a sense of national pride and a sense of new responsibility in their relationship to cinema in the midst of nation-making? Indeed, in all its glory and promises, this new threat was and would be much concern for the writers and moviegoers. This novel was adapted to cinema again in 1968, where we see the same moralistic manner, maybe even in a harsher tone than the novel itself. The narrator in the second film is a police officer who directly addresses the camera and tells us about the corruption of young women and the tragic consequences of their inappropriately modern and westernized behavior. Talking about female spectatorship and male intelligentsia, And here I kind of actually find it a little similar to Pina Menikeli's pose where she was lying on the sofa, but you know, this must be just a common pose as well. So talking about female spectatorship and male intelligentsia, it was very common for the published authors of this period to consider all women as one who easily loses herself under the influence of cinema. This is also frequently thematized by a very famous Turkish poet of the 20th century, Nazım Hikmet. Both in his poetry and in his newspaper articles written in the 1930s, 4 years before the publication of his Mountaineer, which is your, some of lines you're seeing on the slide. 4 years before the publication of this poem, which is about a woman losing herself in the course of a movie, another story published in 1921 depicted a woman who again copied Pina Menikeli. A number of novels by Peyami and Mahmut Yasari also, as I said before, also portrayed the corruption of young women by Italian and French movies in the 20s. This theme appears repeatedly in the newspapers and journals of the period. An important religious leader of the early 20th century named Said Nursi mentioned cinema extensively in his teachings between 1911 and the late 1930s. He used the metaphor of cinema as a gateway to the divine, calling it the cinema of God. He analyzed everyday interactions and objects, including technical devices and means of communications, from the perspective of the Quran. Among them, the cinema offers a great opportunity for him to explain his visions about heaven, purgatory, the transition from life to death, eternity, and the universe as a physical manifestation of God. Nursi never makes any references to individual films, nor does he explicitly appreciate cinema going. As a matter of fact, he deems those who are addicted to cinema, theater, and dance inappropriate and unhealthy from a Puritan perspective. He also viewed the actual spectators as naive young women. When he was in prison in 1931, he writes about an incident where he watches young schoolgirls from the prison window. Around 40 out of a number of 50 to 60 girls appear to him as dead and suffering in hell. 10 of them, in his vision, now look as if they're 70 or 80 years old and hated by people from whom they expect love because of their inability to keep their dignity when they were young. He claims, if they invented a cinema that would be able to show the future, say 50 years from now, just as the cinema that shows us our past, say 50 years ago, and if these girls were able to see their future selves in this film, they would be crying with self-loathing instead of laughing hedonistically. In fact, the afterlife frequently appears in Nursi's visions in what he calls God's cinema, and it is here that his view on time, also explained by a cinema, becomes very clear, and I find fascinating connections with Rashmi's talk here. Regarding women's involvement in cinema making in Turkey, Sabahat Filmer comes across as a pioneer in the early period. Although her name remains under the shadow of her husband in film historiography, she worked in the industry from 1918 onward as a writer, distributor, producer, and finally a dubbing manager. Covering her work involves digging mainly into the memoirs of those working in the industry, since many of the newspapers of the time merely mention her as just a lady working for the Ottoman Army Film Center without using her name. Also, before the surname law, Sabahat published her stories under her father's first name. As we can see from the stories she wrote, she had a tendency to create mainly abstracted and stereotypical woman characters who, in her own words, are either good or bad, evilish, or one with good morals. And this was also, I think, perhaps reflected in her creative work in the films, Binnaz and the Governess. The film, Binnaz was the film that I just mentioned, where she was involved in the team of script writing, and she was also an assistant director for that film. And we can see in her writing she was greatly influenced by her teacher Halide Edip Adıvar, who appeared in the last newsreel we have seen today in the Realize. And it is also, you know, it's not a coincidence, of course, it's also Sabahat Filmer herself, and along with Halide Edip Adıvar, was also among the organizers of the Realize. She was a member of the Society of Veteran Films, she was also involved in the Society of Modern Women, and along with that society, they were organizing these rallies. Her husband was filming the event along with other cameramen, and Sabahat was also one of the speakers, but we haven't seen her in that footage because I think she was in another protest that was organized around the same year. And the films, Sabahat in her memoirs says that those films, they were repeatedly actually screening them, and also other newsreels they shot at the war fronts. They were repeatedly screening them at special screenings that the Ottoman Film Army Center was organizing for Mustafa Kemal or for other government officials. And, you know, Halide Edip's appearance in the film is not, of course, her only involvement with cinema. She was also writing for films, or her novels at least were adapted. But she wrote a lot about cinema, and in which, you know, we can see almost theorizations of cinema, perhaps loosely similar to Virginia Woolf. Both Sabahat Filmer and Halide Edip deserve much detailed treatment, and I'm hoping to do it for another occasion. In the absence of the available filmic material, and sorry, this was Halide Edip Adıvar herself, in the absence of the available filmic material, there may be a need for more creativity in using other resources. And the symposium has already shown a lot of, I guess, creative usage of that, and it will be showing it further. But there is also the added mystery of the women's own names in these resources, and an early film history that does not involve a deep gendered perspective would be one with big gaps. Re-editings, re-adaptations, re-imaginations in the case of women audiences, and remembrances of women pioneers all seem to point to the multi-layered and multi-temporal structures of the archival practices in Turkey too, which is due for a change again with new digitization practices of our era. Thank you.
I switched to a bigger microphone. Thank you so much, Canan. With your paper, you proved that how actually the study of women's history in cinema is sort of related to controversial history. So thank you so much. And now we will conclude with our final presentation by Claudy of Kamp.
Test. Yeah.
She will talk about the very curious subject of how film archives sort of ignore sharing films or orphan works which have ambiguous conditions in means of copyright. So, yeah,
absolutely. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Many thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I am here to, is this okay? Cool. I'm here to speak about a topic that always tends to be the elephant in the room when it comes to archiving and access and copyright. Just for a little bit of context, my name is Claudy. I'm a senior lecturer in film. I'm also a faculty member in the Center for Intellectual Property Policy and Management. So I sit between the two at Bournemouth University in the UK. And I'm also still an adjunct research fellow at Swinburne Law School in Melbourne, Australia, where I finished my postdoctoral research before I went to Bournemouth. Earlier this year, I'm very happy to say that I published this book with Amsterdam University Press. It's called The Greatest Films Never Seen, the Film Archive and the Copyright Smokescreen, which is a reworking of my PhD, which I obtained about 3 years ago. And in it, I have chosen a particular national film archive, so the Netherlands Film Museum, now called the I Film Institute in Amsterdam. And I have reshuffled its film holdings based on the copyright status of the material in order to investigate the digital access practices in the consequent categories. So this has resulted in chapters focusing on categories such as the embargoed film, the orphan film. So orphan films are films of which you don't know who the rights owner is, or where to locate them, so you don't know who to contact for permission to reuse them. The public domain film, which are films of which the rights have expired, so you don't need permission for reuse at all. And the begotten film, which is a chapter about found footage films, in which all the other categories can be seen to come together, and which is partially centered around the work of Gustav Deutsch, who we'll hear more from tomorrow. In every chapter, I have used particular case studies as so-called close-ups. These are film restoration and digital access projects that each deal with particular copyright issues to make what can be somewhat dry material a bit more tangible. And actually, as opposed to what the abstract says, at a conference that focuses on exploring past images in the digital age, I thought that the story of the public domain close-up would actually be a particularly interesting story to tell here, especially in light of some of the material that we've seen this morning, which I believe is all public domain material. So a public domain find in a public sector film archive, that's the case study that I use for that chapter. So film collectors are often very eccentric figures, and the Dutch film collector Joop van Liemt was no exception. He collected just about everything, feature films, documentaries, television films, but also rushes and outtakes. He had a special fondness for the silent period, so the film shot on the inflammable nitrate stock. He owned about 7 warehouses in the Dutch city of Haarlem, just outside of Amsterdam. And as was fitting for an eccentric collector, he was also a bit paranoid. So when a film had 7 reels, for example, he would put, for safety reasons he called it, all the different reels in different warehouses. So no matter the jams that Van Liemt potentially held, this practice obviously led to an impenetrable collection. The Netherlands Film Museum was aware of the rumors that Van Liemt held numerous lost films from the Dutch silent era, and so when he passed away in 2000, they were very quick to acquire his collection. So the so-called Van Liemt collection comprised some 2,000 film cans, which were transferred to the museum's nitrate vaults, and cataloguing the entire collection was a very slow process, and most of the cans had not been opened for a very long time. Some of the material, as you can see here, was in a state of advanced decomposition. So from time to time, the collections department at the museum organized these so-called nitrate days. And because of the possible fumes that could have built up inside the cans, these were organized on clear and dry days. And as such, they could be executed outside. But obviously, the Dutch weather did not allow for many of these days. So an entire team of staff and interns and volunteers would descend upon the archive on these days. And there were no lists of the content, obviously, so the mostly unlabeled cans were then opened one by one. In the first round of identification, obvious and visible details of the films were noted down, and these included film format, whether it was a positive or a negative, possible colors. Intertitles also provided useful information such as production company, logos and names, possibly language or a genre even. And early in this identification process, one of the curators came across an intertitle that bore the name Theodora Fitzgerald. Most of the films in the collection had intertitles in Dutch, and names, as you might know, were often changed in translation. So if the original was in a different language, these might not be the same. She noted it down anyway, and it turned out not to have been translated, and a quick Google search predicted a possibly incredible find. So the name on the intertitle could mean that they had found Beyond the Rocks, which was a lost film from 1922, directed by Sam Wood. Up until then, only photographs of the film survived, and it was the only film in which the two megastars of silent cinema, Gloria Swanson and Rudolph Valentino, ever starred together. So the teaming of the two stars was the first of its kind, and internationally the film was highly sought after, if only for the rarity that stars of such caliber were paired. It took the Netherlands Film Museum the larger part of 3 years to find all the 7 reels of the film. So often there was despair about whether they would find all of the missing cans in the scrambled up collection, but they did. And in late 2003, the first reel, which announced the title and the stars, was incidentally the last one to be found. And the film's discovery, 80 years after it was made, was news all around the world. But for the world to see it, the film needed to be restored. So Beyond the Rocks was originally produced and distributed by Paramount Pictures in the US with a theatrical release date of 1922. And with a US publishing date from before 1923, the film was a public domain title. And indeed, in the US, any work with an authorized publication date from before 1923 is automatically in the public domain. And this makes the film an ideal case study of the relationship between the film's legal status and its digital distribution. This relationship is particularly interesting in the context of a public archive for 2 reasons. A public sector archive often has a remit to preserve, restore, and provide access to their holdings. And then the copyright dichotomy between intellectual and material property, which in this context means that film archives, on the one hand, own or hold on deposit many physical works of film, but the copyright owner, on the other hand, might be someone quite different. And that is particularly interesting when the rights to works have expired and the safeguarding institution has exclusive control of the access to the physical holding. And it was, of course, this particular combination, so the material's public domain status, plus its resurfacing in a public sector institution, that led to its restoration and re-release at all. So a little bit of backstory. Beyond the Rocks was produced and distributed in 1922 and initially in copyright for 28 years. That was the term at the time in the US. So although the rediscovery of the film was a worldwide spectacle, its initial release was not that successful. The teaming of the stars caused a sensation, but the reviewers were not very kind. And over time, the film disappeared entirely off the radar. When the copyright to the film came up for renewal in 1950, Paramount did not renew it. We don't know exactly what happened, or why it was not renewed. The major Hollywood studios generally took care to renew their films, although sometimes they obviously made mistakes. Around 1950, Paramount's focus was also on other things. So silent films, of course, weren't in vogue anymore. Sound had taken over. They were making huge successes such as Sunset Boulevard, incidentally, also a film, of course, with Gloria Swanson. And in 1966, Beyond the Rocks was missing from the Swanson retrospective at the George Eastman House, despite that archive's efforts to make the program exhaustive. In 1980, the film star mentioned in her autobiography, Swanson on Swanson, that she had been and still was looking for a copy of the film. So not only was the film out of copyright, it also seemed as if Paramount did not hold any materials to the film anymore. The Netherlands Film Museum did not need permission from Paramount for restoration, as the film, as well as the underlying novel by Eleanor Glynn, were in the public domain. The film was one of the first entirely digitally restored feature films in the world, and it has become a showpiece for both the Netherlands Film Museum and Haga Film Conservation, the Dutch lab that executed the restoration. The restoration was a huge project for all the partners involved in terms of investment, exposure, and techniques employed. And this comes from Jonah Fossati's book, Combining Analog and Digital Tools. The film was restored to a total of 7 different versions. These included Dutch and English versions, as well as silent and sound versions, as a newly composed musical score was added to the film. The museum sought outside funding for the project, and it was ING Real Estate that ended up paying the bill, a totaling €200,000. Paramount, as the original producing and distributing studio, did not help restore or re-release their film. In the course of the restoration, the film's correct editing was reconstructed, multiple tinted colors were added, and the Dutch intertitles were replaced with English ones. This was done based on the continuity script held in the Paramount Scripts collection at the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy in Los Angeles. And although the script was also in the public domain, the Netherlands Film Museum, out of courtesy reasons, asked for Paramount's permission for using the continuity script of the film as the basis for the new intertitles. Because after all, Paramount controlled the access to the material holding of the public domain script. Representatives for Paramount have never officially commented on their non-involvement in the film's restoration and release. But in 2010, when I was working on my PhD, I was able to interview Barry Allen, who's the by then already retired Paramount Pictures executive director of film preservation. It was very difficult to make him comment on the specific case, but he did address the studio's general film preservation approach by saying, this quote, "Motion picture preservation depends on a solid copyright. The costs are enormous, and copyright gives the incentive and the ability to recoup that kind of cost. Sometimes a film gets lost because the rights change hands and it goes into storage or it gets moved. It goes into somebody's estate, you lose trails, but I cannot think of anything that's really important that might have slipped through. If there were copyright renewals still in place, I think they would be much more likely not to miss a renewal now, because I don't know of anybody who doesn't think there is something out there that hasn't any value at all, no matter how bad it is. You're probably going to be able to use it." So a tentative conclusion from Alan's comments is that Beyond the Rocks was not that important because the film did slip through. And had the film still been in copyright, it might not have been lost. That does, however, not mean that the film would have been publicly accessible, because the studio might have decided to not distribute the film at all if the necessary investment in the restoration of the title would not have been worth the potential profit. And so with only a couple of thousand DVD copies, and that might sound a lot, but this release would have been too small probably for Paramount. And with the film being in the public domain, there is no protection against a possible infringement. So the restored film saw a theatrical release as well as a DVD release, which was licensed to Milestone Film, a US independent film distribution company. The Netherlands Film Museum, I hope you can see it here, just above the logo, claimed copyright in the restoration, a practice that deserves its own presentation altogether. They did so based on the creative interventions in the restoration I mentioned before, and Milestone filed a copy of the film at the Copyright Office at the Library of Congress in the name of the Netherlands Film Museum. Here you see a copyright record for the new version of the film, the original of which, as I mentioned, was never renewed. Dennis Doras, who's the founder of Milestone, is the first person to acknowledge, however, that this construction might not hold up under court. It just hasn't been tested. What a focus on access to public domain films helps to indicate is that the kind of archive plays a role in the shaping of access practices. Although public domain works can be used without the need for permission from the rights holder, it does not mean that they are publicly accessible. The archive helps to create a particular potential for film history making in deciding to make a film publicly accessible. And archives are therefore involved in what Vernon Deasley calls the significant opportunity for interplay between the ownership of the physical object and the ability to control the subsequent use and dissemination of the work. Intellectual access implies material access, and public accessibility is not only controlled by those who own the rights, but also by those who own the physical assets. This becomes interesting when the work is in the public domain, and particularly interesting when the material is unique, with obvious far-reaching consequences for the visibility of the films. There are great differences in the ways in which different kinds of archives provide access to their public domain holdings. Public sector archives seldom own the rights to the films that they safeguard, so for restoration and distribution purposes, they benefit from the rights to these works having expired. A practice of which Beyond the Rocks is of course a great example. Commercial archives, on the other hand, will own the copyright to most of their holdings and will therefore frequently exploit those materials in favor of their public domain holdings. Legal scholar Pamela Samuelson has stated that a painting from the mid-19th century that remains in a private collection or was destroyed in a fire is in theory in the public domain as a matter of copyright law, but its non-public nature or its destruction mean that it may in fact be there only in theory. And I'd like to argue that just like a mid-19th century painting that remains in a private collection, some of the public domain works held by film archives also reside in a theoretical public domain only. They do not reside in a practical public domain because of their non-public nature combined with the archive's exclusive ownership of the physical materials. And it is particularly in the shift from analog to digital distribution that differences in practices by the different kinds of archives become most visible. An example in the commercial realm is the DVD on demand and now streaming initiative Warner Archive Online, in which no public domain titles are being made available. The lack is most visible in the absence of pre-1923 films, but also public domain titles from the later years are missing. And an example on the public end of the spectrum is Celluloid Remix, which was an online remix contest with early Dutch films. It took place in 2009 for the first time and was made up, perhaps unsurprisingly, exclusively of public domain material. So in a commercial setting, the public domain titles are fading from public view, whereas in a public environment, they become hyper-visible. This causes a so-called digital skew in archival sources, which is a discrepancy between analog and digital holdings, which has important consequences for the potential for history making of those sources. So to conclude, film archives, both for and not-for-profit ones, are subjected to copyright law, which brings certain constraints, but they also exert control over their holdings and make productive use of copyright in their involvement in that aforementioned interplay between ownership and the dissemination of materials. They are active sites of agency, power, and resistance as they help shape a particular potential for history making of archival sources. And then lastly, to return to Beyond the Rocks, Gloria Swanson marries a wealthy yet very unappealing older man for the sake of her poverty-stricken family, but she really loves Valentino. And they can initially contain themselves, but it does not take too much imagination for love to trump money at the end of the film. The story of the film prince's journey from a Hollywood studio to a public sector film archive is quite similar. The studio let the film lapse into the public domain and lost track of the film material. So ultimately, it was a mad collector and a public archive who made the love of silent film fans trump over the studio's needs for their return on investment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claudy. Thanks to your presentation, now we have stronger statements for pushing the Ministry of Culture for sharing high-definition copies of their holdings. I'm just kidding, but it was really helpful listening to this difference between holding the intellectual property and holding the material copies of these films. Thank you so much. So now we have around 10 to 15 minutes for the Q&A session. So please just raise your hands if you have questions. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a question for Esin and Elif. Besides the initiative of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism to make their holdings available, I enthusiastically applaud the project that you and your team have undertaken. And even though, there comes a but, and even though I realize that this is only volume 1, I don't know how many volumes are planned, but I hope more. But there's something, and maybe I'm naive, but there's something that you have to explain to me, which, let me explain my naivete first, because when I see the term cinema locations, the first thing I think of is, okay, these are the sites where production companies were housed, there were cinemas and other film-related buildings, but it turned out to be locations in fiction films. And I do need to understand why you chose that particular subject first, because yeah, I cannot say otherwise, because it seems much less important to me in a certain way than, for instance, the locations that I just mentioned. So can you sort of enlighten me that, so that I don't need to ask this question anymore?
As Elif said, the volumes are endless. We have so many volumes in mind. But why we came up with locations, I think, is that we were actually having a drink in a cinematic location together when it came up. And then we, I don't know if you realize, but lots of buildings are being demolished in Istanbul. And like every day we found ourselves talking about, oh, you know, this building is gone as well, you know, we should have gone there and had a drink or, you know, photograph it. And then when we heard that Atatürk Cultural Center, which was one of the landmarks of the Taksim Square, was going to be demolished, we went there with our assistants and we filmed. You know, we wanted to, you know, film it before it was demolished. And then we wanted to go and shoot the process of, you know, like each day that you would see that, you know, it's going down and down. So then I think that was kind of, I mean, there is nothing academic in it. It was just that we just thought we wanted to keep them. So, right? I mean, is there anything you want to add?
I first thought you were referring why we chose the word location, but
No, my association with the word location was something else. Because to come back to what you said, I mean, you can also imagine that a lot of cinema theaters are disappearing, for instance, or locations of them.
That's one of our buildings actually. Festivals, yeah. Theaters as well.
You're talking about filming location, no?
mention to the second clip we've shown, even though that's the interior, it's not a set. It's the interior of a mansion, which was used sort of like a studio during the Yeşilçam period. So we thought that's kind of interesting too. It's an actual space, basically.
On that point, I do a lot of location scouting, mapping in England. And I find it's a really interesting way of connecting with a different kind of public, because the locations that people see on screen mean a great deal to them when they see them in reality. It's a kind of imaginary remapping of the world that you know. If you live in London, you have two versions of London. The London you live in, but you have the London you've seen on the screen, which is often different, related but different. And I do tours of locations in London because I find it really is a way of evoking cinema memory for those who do it. So I applaud what you're doing. I think it's really interesting, and there are lots of people doing similar things. Often there are many books, for instance, about locations in London, which are fascinating. And of course there's the great film LA Plays Itself, which I'm sure you know, which is a study of LA as seen on screen, which is wonderful. But I think the house you're looking for doesn't exist. It's a studio set, obviously. To me, it looks very much like a studio set that's been reused many times.
No, it's an actual house. It's a house.
Well, okay.
People have written about it, so but we don't know where it is located. People have written about these houses that were used as similar to a studio, where you would have, I don't know how many films per week they would shoot in the same house, so that's why you find it in so many films anyway.
Within 1 year.
Yeah, the production houses were renting those mansions per year, and you know, all the production they have done, they use the same mansions. That's why they keep reappearing. And actually, we were looking at old magazines, and you would see interviews where actually after renting one mansion, they want to have another mansion, that they have a kind of a neighborhood where all stars would just, they would, during their coffee breaks, they will just, appear in between films, because they're just close by. And, like we found so many interviews of actors, because they're just facing each other, so. Yeah, convenience, yeah.
Can I just, what I was going to say was that Professor Çelikcan, forgive my bad pronunciation, those tour films, those early location films, I think it's really, I find it very important to remind people that film comes along at the end of a very long period, 50 years of photography, of people taking cameras to exotic locations and producing essentially stereo photographs. The stereo sets, the stereograph sets, which were a huge trade in the 19th century, are the real precursors of the films that cameramen went out to make, I think. That repertoire of places that you went to shoot was very well established by the time film came along. So in a sense, film is the last stage of a long topographic history that goes back 50, 60 years to the dawn of photography. But I think the missing link is actually stereography, because the stereo trade was so enormous by the latter part of the 19th century that it really imprinted itself on the public that was then interested to see the moving film as a kind of appendix to what they already knew from stereo.
Magic Lantern.
Well, the Magic Lantern too, obviously. The tour format comes from Magic Lantern shows. The very phrase travelogue was invented by the Magic Lanternists before they even started using film. So I think it's worth building in the precursors.
I just wanted to ask you about editing of this footage of the locations. how did you decide which film comes after the other? And why did you decide, and how did you decide to use the soundtrack of one to cover everything? And a third remark is, it would be easier to follow the scene if you changed the format to the right formats, because some of them were distorted. So, are you going to do that? Is this just a working copy, or?
No, this is just a working copy. Actually, we asked our students to prepare it specifically for this conference so that the audience could have an understanding of the repetitive scenes. So it was their choice mostly, because we let them do what they prefer to do. And instead of using the soundtrack for the Galata Bridge, there was too much noise and dialogue and voiceover narration in most of those scenes, so it wouldn't really work well. So he chose to use this song that was actually sung by the bridge as a bridge, let's say, to bring all these cuts together. And in the second one, dialogue worked more or less, so we said, why not keep it? Because in terms of composition, it said what it had to say anyway. That's why we left it like that.
But if I am not wrong, Street Sailor played the song.
He kind of made it into his own narrative, I must admit. He's a little bit creative. He wanted to do stuff with this edit. So that's why it felt as if he was playing the song in the second shot.
The song is sung by Zekimran in Hindistan.
Yes.
That's
Thank you very much for your speech. My question goes to Claudy and then to Elif, my colleague. First of all, I would like to ask about copyright. If we just taking like a portion of, let's say, a scene from a movie, how is the copyright for that? And then for Elif and Esin, I guess, how would you like get the copyrights of all the movies that you want to put in the archive? Because it's going to be very difficult. Okay, probably the Ministry of Culture is going to help you with that, but there are some of the rights which the Ministry probably will not get access to those content. So it's a great idea, it's a great initiative to have this, but I think it's going to be very, very expensive and very, very difficult, I think, to achieve. So how do you intend to do that?
Reusing clips, it depends on, the answer in anything legal is always, it depends, right? So it depends on where you do it and for what purpose, mostly. So I can speak for the UK, for instance, where we have a system called fair dealing exceptions, which are very specific categories which you have to adhere to. So for instance, the reporting of current news events or criticism and review. There's one that's called caricature, parody and pastiche. And one of the newest ones is quotation, which is a very, very open exception. And then once you meet that category, there's a couple of factors that you need to take into consideration. So that would be the amount that you use. So usually it's not defined in the law, but usually that is not more than is necessary to make your point. It also, your use of the material shouldn't encroach on the market for the original. So if your use is deemed commercially competitive for the original, then you probably wouldn't meet those exceptions. But like I said, that's very much the UK environment. In the US, that's called fair use exception, which is a much more open-ended exception. And for instance, in the Netherlands, we don't have anything like fair use or fair dealing. There you have to deal with general copyright exceptions, which are in place in multiple countries. But the situation is so different in the variety of countries that there's just no one answer to that. Although most legislations would have a sort of quotation exception, But I also would like to add that in most countries that has not been tested for film at all. So we're very familiar with quotation in literature, and we all realize, and we all know how to do that and how to attribute. But we actually don't know what quotation in film means. That would be if you want to use it for free. But of course, the most common situation is you go to the rights holder, if you know who that is, because that's an added complication, and ask for their permission. And either you get it for free or you engage in a licensing agreement with them in which you make a contract for your specific use. I can talk about this forever, so we can do that later. The second one is much more complicated, but also actually quite simple, because it depends on what kind of archive you are, but if you are, say, a public national institution, so I can highlight a little bit the Dutch situation. So if a filmmaker or whoever has the rights to a collection of films and they donate or put on deposit or whatever arrangement that they have with the archive, I would say nowadays the legal counsel of the iFilm Institute would actually ask you to then also assign your rights to the archive. Not everybody, of course, is interested in doing that. In the past, that did not tend to happen, and as most archivists know, it's quite a random practice often how films end up at an archive, right? It's literally stuff arriving at the back door. I mean, this is what often happened in the past, and most archives have such a backlog that most of the time you don't even know where that stuff has come from. So acquiring it after the fact is not an easy thing, because you actually have to know whose material it is and who you would have to acquire it from. So that doesn't tend to happen, to my knowledge. In terms of some numbers, so for instance, the BFI, the British Film Institute, and the iFilm Institute have sort of comparable numbers, that the percentage of what they think they own themselves, so that's either the material that they own the rights to, or that's in the public domain, so they have the right to exploit that material, is in both instances less than 5% of the entire collection. So everything else is third-party owned. Now, commercial archives, and I want to say most Hollywood studios would classify as that, would own most of their material. Does that make sense? So they hardly have any real, what we would consider as orphan work, so that you actually don't know who owns it anymore. Those things, tend to happen much less in commercial environments. Again, I can talk about this until you stop me, so we can discuss. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Okay. I would like to ask Elif and Esin to kind of, do you plan to monetize your website, or are you just going to do it for free?
We plan to create a database for research with no commercial interest. So in an ideal world, we wouldn't want to pay any copyright for anything that we put up. But out of, I think about 2/3 of the films that we plan to put up, there won't be whole films anyway on the website, just bits, scenes, maybe 2-3 minutes from each, even, I don't know. So we did talk to some producers. Out of 2/3, like I said, of all the films that we want to put in, come from this Yeşilçam period. So we've talked to some producers, I guess about 3 or 4 of them. And those are some of the biggest studios during those periods, and they are, verbally, they are interested in what we're doing, and they do plan to lend this material for us for free, because we plan to also have links to their websites, or if they have YouTube channels, things like that. Perhaps we won't have all the films up there, as moving images, but we still will have this metadata, basically, time codes and stuff like that, for the user to at least to go on their own. And
this is really sort of a comment to everybody who's working on digital film archives. I wanted to point out a couple of examples that friends of mine have been working on. There's one website called Padma, it's pad.me, which is actually a very interesting repository of unused footage donated by filmmakers. And they invite artists or whoever, researchers, to reuse the footage and create work out of it. It's pad.me. And the other one is a huge project called indiancine.ma, which came out of the Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema. And it's a very interesting kind of approach to archiving and annotation and the database. It's a crowd-managed website by the community of film studies researchers who are working on Indian cinema. And this is unofficial, I hope this doesn't go out of this room, but there are 3 levels of entry. So if you Google indiancine.ma, you'll only get access to films that are out of copyright. But there's a second level, which is a researcher. So if you're active in film studies, you can get access to stuff that you may not have access to or you shouldn't have access to. And then there's a third level, which is you contribute to the website. So I can go in and create my own list like you have done with the location. So if I say lipsticks in Indian cinema, right, I can look for all those scenes that have lipsticks or telephone, and I can create my own playlist, and I can share them with the community of film studies scholars who annotate entire films but also sequences. So it's quite playful in that sense. And you can see the entire strip of the film like a painting. And so you can see what is the length, you know, if you want to look at the work of one filmmaker, you can see what duration of shots does that filmmaker generally tend to use, or color template. So it might be an interesting website for you guys to look into, especially if you can find a community that will run it. That's been the big challenge, because you know people have put in a lot of work and labor, and actually the people who've designed, the architects of the website, are 2 cinephile hackers who live in Berlin. Yeah, so I mean they've put in a lot of work to design it, but then to actually keep it running, because that's the other challenge of an archive. You know, it's difficult enough to make one, but then to get people to use it is, so yeah.
I think there's already a Turkish version of it, right? turkishcine.ma, which has the same features.
Yeah, it's the same hackers who've made Turkish cinema.
Yeah, so maybe actually this brings us to the issue of, you know, how to communicate multiple projects that are revolving around similar or related subjects. Because at the moment there are a couple of projects related to Turkish cinema, but at some points they are not connected. So maybe one more question and then we need to conclude. Okay, then I'll ask the last question. This is the beauty of being the chair. So my question is for actually Canan. So Canan, basically in your presentation we listened to your diagnosis about how the history of human is sort of ignored or neglected. But I'm curious also about your recipe. So are there any case studies that you are thinking about delving into for depicting actually how human history can be written?
Well, in Turkish case, of course.
Yeah, in Turkish case, exactly.
No, at the moment I'm working on both Halide Edip and Sabahat Filmer. I've presented papers on them individually. I'm sort of trying to write an entry about them for Women Film Pioneers project, and hopefully for the next Women in the Silent Screen conference, this time I'm gonna find more. This time I'm hoping to find connections between the 2. Other than just being one as a teacher and the Sabahat Filmer as her student or assistant, I think there are other connections between them. This is an intuition in the sense that Sabahat's literary work or at least even the scripts of Binnaz and Mrebbiye are sort of, you know, kind of similar to a Halide Edip novel. But, you know, these are very loose connections as well, so I'm sort of hoping to dive deeper into them. And, you know, as for the resources, Halide Edip's novels, you know, she mentions cinema very extensively in her novels, and, you know, she has written about cinema in newspapers and in Tamasha as well, and also, you know, her choice for example, for Shirt of Flame, some people claim it was actually Atatürk who sort of who get the first Muslim women as an actress, but a lot of other resources also indicate that it was Halide Edip who insisted that it should be played by a Turkish Muslim woman. And, you know, she was, you know, I'm sort of trying to delve deeper into Halide and Sabahat Filmer, and, you know, also there are many literary texts that refer to women as spectators. It's flourishing in the period, or in the literature of this period.
Great.